In 1907, a government anthropologist sat in a Hopi village and was told something that should have rewritten American history books. It didn't. He was told the exact location where the Hopi people first emerged into this world. Not a story for children. A specific physical location, a hole in the earth at the bottom of a canyon, through which an entire people claimed their ancestors walked out of one world into another. He wrote it down. It was published in an obscure journal and forgotten by everyone except the people who already knew it was true. 2 years later, in 1909, a newspaper described a hidden complex inside that exact same canyon, and the country treated it as a brand new discovery. It wasn't new. The Hopi had known for so long nobody could say when the knowledge began. What changed in 1909 is that an outsider stumbled into the edge of something the Hopi had protected with absolute discipline for centuries, and the silence guarding it suddenly had a public problem standing on its doorstep. This is the Sipapu, not a metaphor, a place, identified by Hopi tradition near the confluence of the Little Colorado and the main Colorado River, deep inside the Grand Canyon, the opening through which the Hopi emerged into this world, the fourth world, after the one before it ended. This is treated by the Hopi not as religious allegory, as historical memory, and the geography is not vague. Hopi oral tradition treats spatial precision as sacred obligation. When elders describe its location, they are not gesturing at a region. They are reporting a fact passed down with the same seriousness a surveyor uses for coordinates, which means when the Hopi say something is there, they are not speculating. If you need to know what's actually down there, stay with me. Subscribe now so you don't lose this one halfway through. The Sipapu itself is the part the Hopi have always discussed openly. Public cosmology, but researchers trusted enough to get close to Hopi communities found a second layer, one never offered freely, not a single opening, a network, passages connecting the Sipapu outward to other sacred sites across Arizona, Utah, and possibly beyond, described independently across decades by elders unconnected to each other. And the inconsistency between their accounts is not a weakness, it's the proof. Fabricated stories built for outsiders come out clean and identical. Real oral tradition carried separately across generations phrase at the edges. Core facts hold, details shift. That's exactly what these accounts do. They weren't repeating an agreed upon story. They were describing the same place from different distances. One more detail changes everything. The Hopi never described this network as something hidden because of European arrival. They described it as concealed long before any outsider reached North America, built into the tradition as protection against disruption they believed would come again. Not a reaction, a preparation, which means the silence that confused a 1909 reporter, the silence the Smithsonian dismissed, was never about that article. It was a strategy older than the article by generations, and what it was protecting is still down there. Here is what nobody tells you about the Sipapu. The emergence point itself is small, a single opening. If that's all the tradition described, this would be a footnote in an anthropology textbook. It isn't all the tradition described. What the Hopi protected was never a hole in the ground. It was what the hole connected to. Multiple ethnographers, working independently across 5 decades, documented fragments of something none of them fully understood at the time, because no single researcher was ever shown the whole thing. A network, passages running outward from the Sipapu beneath the canyon floor, connecting that single emergence point to other sacred locations scattered across the region. Some accounts placed connected sites in northern Arizona. Some extended the system into Utah. A handful of researchers, comparing field notes decades apart, recorded elders gesturing toward locations even further out, suggesting a system larger than any single tribe's territory could explain. One detail makes this worse. Several of the locations described by Hopi elders as connected to this network site on a near-perfect straight line alignment when plotted on a map, a pattern that should not exist if these were separate, unrelated sacred sites chosen independently over centuries. It suggests planning. It suggests the network was engineered, not discovered piece by piece over generations. Nobody has ever mapped the full extent of it, because nobody outside the tradition was ever shown the full extent of it. Here's the detail that should stop you completely. The accounts don't match. One elder describes 3 connected sites, another describes 5. One places an entrance behind a specific rock formation, another describes an entirely different approach, miles away. If this had been fabricated for outside consumption, it would be clean, identical, polished smooth by repetition like a tourist legend. It isn't. It frays exactly the way real oral tradition frays when it travels through separate families across separate generations without central coordination. The core holds, the edges shift. That is not the signature of fiction. That is the signature of memory. Now ask the harder question. What was a tunnel network this extensive actually used for? Some accounts describe pilgrimage, sacred journeys between connected sites performed only by specific religious leaders at specific times, for reasons never explained to outsiders. Other accounts describe something closer to a vault, objects placed deep inside in locations chosen specifically because they were nearly impossible to reach without knowledge passed down only through initiation. Researchers who got close enough to the tradition to hear fragments describe items the elders refused to name directly, only that they were old and that they were not meant to be found by accident. And one detail appears across multiple independent accounts with a consistency that cuts through every other variation. The objects were positioned there deliberately to survive something. Not a flood, not a fire, a disruption the tradition believed would come again. This is where the story stops being about archaeology and starts being about strategy. Because the Hopi did not build this system of concealment after Europeans arrived, the tradition is explicit about timing. This practice, hiding what matters most in places only the initiated could find, was already old when the first outsider crossed into Hopi territory. Which means whatever disruption the tradition was preparing for was not colonization. Colonization, when it came, simply proved the preparation had been necessary all along. And that raises the question almost nobody asks out loud. If a tradition spends centuries preparing for a disruption before it happens, what told them it was coming? So picture the moment now. It's 1909. A newspaper reporter working with a self-described Smithsonian-affiliated explorer publishes a sensational front-page story about chambers and passages hidden deep in the canyon wall. To everyone reading it that morning, a discovery. To the Hopi elders who saw the headline, a centuries-old secret had just been described, badly, incompletely, by someone who understood almost none of what he was looking at. And they had a choice. Confirm it. Add context. Risk handing over the only thing standing between that network and total exposure, or say nothing, and let an entire country decide the story was probably a hoax. They chose silence, not because they had nothing to say, because they understood exactly what saying it would cost. Silence is easy to misread. To outsiders in 1909, Hopi silence looked like evasion, proof there was nothing to confirm. The Smithsonian said the explorer never existed. The Hopi said nothing at all. And in the absence of a denial loud enough to compete with a front-page headline, the entire story quietly collapsed into folklore. That collapse was not an accident. It was the outcome the silence was designed to produce. To understand why, you have to understand something about how sacred knowledge actually functions inside Hopi tradition, because it works nothing like the outside world assumes. An elder can carry knowledge his entire life and never speak it publicly, not because the knowledge is forbidden, because disclosure without proper context destroys the thing being disclosed. A sacred location described to someone outside the tradition stops being sacred the moment it's spoken. It becomes a coordinate, a target, a line item in someone else's expedition plan. That mechanism is what the elders understood instinctively in 1909. It explains every decision that followed. Now look at the timeline, because the timing here is not incidental. 1901, the Santa Fe Railway reaches the South Rim. 1908, 7 years later, The canyon becomes a national monument. 1919, 11 years after that, a national park. Each step framed publicly as conservation. Each step functioning legally as acquisition. Converting land Hopi nations had relationships with for thousands of years into a federal commercial asset, with zero obligation to consult the people who actually understood what was underneath it. The railway brought tourists. Tourists brought revenue. Revenue attracted federal interest that moved exactly the way frontier capitalism always moves, toward extraction, toward ownership, toward converting anything of value into something sellable. Into that environment, a 1909 article describing chambers and tunnels inside the canyon wasn't curiosity. It was a liability standing in the path of a land grab already in motion. Think about what confirmation would have actually triggered. If the Smithsonian had stood behind that article instead of denying it, expeditions would have entered that canyon within months, not years. Every research institution, every private collector, every opportunist with enough rope would have had a published starting point and a head start. The elders did not need a law degree to see where that ended. They had already lived through the Dawes Act, watching tribal land broken apart under federal authority. They had already watched their children taken to boarding schools built specifically to erase the exact kind of knowledge sitting inside the Sipapu network. They had already watched what happened every single time indigenous knowledge entered the public record without its protective context. It got extracted, reclassified, relabeled American heritage instead of Hopi heritage, finishing the same legal logic already applied to the land sitting above it. So when the moment came, the calculation was simple. A truth handed over without context is not a truth, it's a commodity. And once something becomes a commodity, the people who held it as sacred lose all say in what happens to it next. This is what the silence actually protected, not shame, not fiction. The only mechanism available to them inside a legal system stacked entirely against them. Refusal. Refusal to confirm. Refusal to clarify. Refusal to hand a half-true newspaper story the missing context that would have turned it into an unstoppable expedition. And here's the part almost nobody says out loud. The Smithsonian's denial, whatever its real motivation, functioned as unintentional protection. It slapped a hoax label on the entire story, and that label did more to keep that canyon undisturbed for the next century than any locked gate ever could have. The institution trying to bury the story and the people trying to protect it ended up wanting the exact same outcome, for completely opposite reasons. One detail almost nobody connects. The Hopi tradition never described this network as something concealed because of outsiders. It described concealment as a practice already in place, generations before any newspaper, any railway, any federal survey existed. Built to protect what mattered most through periods of disruption, the tradition believed were destined to return again and again across long cycles of time. Colonization didn't create the need for the silence. It simply proved the silence had always been necessary. So where does that leave us now? The Grand Canyon remains one of the least archaeologically surveyed landscapes in the country relative to its size. Less than 10% of its terrain has ever been systematically examined. The deep interior, the cliff formations from 1909, the regions tied to the Sipapu network, still largely untouched. Not because they're inaccessible, because the same incentives that shaped 1909 still shape today. A tourism economy worth hundreds of millions a year does not benefit from evidence of continuous, sophisticated, pre-contact occupation that complicates a century of federal land claims. Different architects, same structure, but something has shifted. Younger Hopi scholars are beginning to discuss fragments of this knowledge in academic settings, carefully, on their own terms, with enough legal protection and reclaimed cultural authority that some of what was sealed away for over a century might finally surface on terms the tradition itself can accept. That matters. It's the result of more than 100 years of strategic silence, held at enormous cost by people who understood they were protecting something far larger than a tourist attraction. They were protecting a record, kept intact specifically so someone someday would still be there to read it. The canyon still holds what it has always held. The question now is whether the world finally deserves to be told.